This is the European History Lecture for Monday, the 7th of June, 2021. We had talked about the completion of the Cold War last time. Now it's the dissolution of the European empires, decolonization, and the appearance of the Third World. We start out with the fact that in 1945, the United Nations consisted of just over 50 countries. Today, it consists of almost 200, I think. And the reason for that is that most of the world was still a part of Europe's empires, right at the end of World War II. What this means is that a map of the world would still show French West Africa, French Indochina, French Central Africa, French Guiana, and a bunch of other colonies. It would still show the British Empire around the world, including India and Pakistan, Palestine, and most of a strip from Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope. And these parts of the world were ruled from Europe, and those parts of the world that weren't directly under Europe's control were, like most of the Americas, under the control of Europeans who came here to colonize. And that's true for the United States, that's true for Chile, Argentina. Canada is still part of the British Empire, sort of, it's a dominion. Like Australia and New Zealand, Canada is in a semi-independent, semi-British Empire state. Just 35 years later, in 1980, the European empires are almost completely gone. So this is a fundamental transformation of how the world is governed. And it's going to create a lot of history that we have very little time to talk about. One interesting thing about the United Nations as a result of this, the Soviets complained that the British were getting representatives from countries like Australia and New Zealand and Canada, which were semi-independent dominions. The Soviet Union demanded that its various socialist republics be given additional status as nations within the United Nations and votes within the United Nations. To which the American representatives said, fine, we'll take 50 of those because we have 50 independent states within the United States. The Russians backed off and accepted 3. Russia, or the Soviet Union, the Belarusian SSR, the White Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, now called Belarus, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is now called the Ukraine. So we get 1 vote. The Soviets get 3 votes. The British have a bunch of dominions that each get votes, but are increasingly independent as time goes on. Decolonization starts with a sharp event. Sometimes history slowly evolves, but doesn't reveal that evolution until a big turning point moment. And sometimes the big turning point moment creates the change. In the case of decolonization, the turning point moment is 1956. The place is Suez, the Suez Canal in Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, the world's jugular vein, the world's central point of trade, the world's greatest choke point for trade. Egypt had been part of the British Empire, but in the early 1950s was given its independence as a kingdom. However, within a year or two, the king of Egypt has been overthrown by a group of young officers led by a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser is a Ba'athist. Ba'athism, B-A''ATHISM, Ba'athism is Arab socialism. It is socialism with Arab characteristics. And like the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire before World War I, the young officers have many, many plans for many, many things. Nasser is going to nationalize the Suez Canal, which is a violation of the treaty. Good to see you. You signed in with the office?
Yeah.
Great. I'm glad to hear that your tire thing was fixed. Nasser was going to nationalize the canal, violate the treaty, and kick out the Anglo-French company that's running the canal even after Egyptian independence. Nasser is also going to aggressively go after the Israelis. And Nasser, to do this, is going to flirt with both the United States and the Soviet Union. Ultimately, he will go to the prom with the Soviet Union, not with the United States. Nasser is seen by British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, Churchill's successor, as a new aggressor, as a new Mussolini or a new Hitler, who's violating treaties, who's making demands, who's building up his military. It seems to him like the 1930s all over again. Eden wants to stop Nasser by, frankly, overthrowing him and putting into power a much more moderate Egyptian government like the one that had been there under the kingdom. To do this, the British proposed to the French and the Israelis a plan. Remember, the French have been also defrauded by the Egyptian seizure of the canal. They had legal rights to be there. And the Israelis were consulted because the Egyptians were prominent in the war that they had just fought for independence. Egypt, like most like all Arab countries in those days, was a declared enemy of the state of Israel, wanting to destroy it. The plan is simple. In early November 1956, the Israelis are going to invade the Sinai Peninsula, this little dimple of land hanging down between Africa and Asia, between Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Sinai Peninsula is going to be occupied by Israel. Britain and France will mobilize Mediterranean forces, land paratroops along the Suez Canal, and will seize the canal from both ends and hold it, ostensibly to keep the Israelis and the Egyptians apart. In reality, this is all prearranged. Israel will control the Sinai up to the Suez Canal, and the British and French will control the canal, and the Egyptians will control the rest of their country. It works at first. Nasser is surprised. The Baathists look incompetent. The British, French, and Israelis each play their part. Israel invades. Britain and France comes in to keep them separated. Except they didn't take something into account. For the last couple of months, the world had been proclaiming the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary in 1956, remember, same year, as immoral, as neocolonialism, as the naked use of force to keep captive populations in line. And then, without consulting American President Eisenhower, days before a presidential election, remember, it's early November 1956, that's a presidential election year, suddenly the British, French, and the Israelis pull this. So it looks like Hungary is only one place where great powers are going to exert force to control captive populations. It looks bad in terms of the moral supremacy that the West had over the Soviets on this issue, and it looks bad because it's clearly a sham. Mainly, though, Eisenhower has a temper. Remember, this is the man who led the attack on Germany from the West. He is not somebody you easily trifle with. The Soviets never messed with him beyond a certain point because they understood this is a man who has the chops to function and to succeed where others would fail. Eisenhower, in his moment of anger, goes on international television and also through embassies and the State Department, makes it clear that if the British and French and Israelis don't immediately withdraw back to their pre-crisis borders, The United States will yank the rug out from under all of them. And at this time, the United States is the guarantor of the British, French, and Israeli economies, the British, French, and Israeli defense departments. Without us, they will collapse. Those governments that run those countries will certainly fall. In other words, in 1956, Britain, France, and Israel are completely dependent upon the United States, and the American president has just spanked them in front of the rest of the world. So, the British and French fall back, humiliated. The French government will ultimately fall, and Charles de Gaulle will come back. The British government loses a prime minister, but the Conservative Party remains in power. But the new government is going to be willing to ramp down empire. The only key people who come out of this looking good, because the Egyptians still look incompetent, are the Israelis. The Israelis have kicked Arab butt. They've won a conventional war, and from their point of view, this is a good point. This is a good moment because the Arabs now will respect Israeli strength even further. Later, Eisenhower admits it was a boneheaded move. Nasser is a Soviet ally. Nasser makes a lot of trouble for Israel and for the United States in the Middle East. Maybe Eisenhower should not have been angry, but it was days before an election. An election he was prepared to win easily, which he did win easily, but this is throwing a wrench into the machinery, and he expected to be consulted about something like this, and he wasn't. So having a temper doesn't always work out. Okay, so a few years later, in 1960, the successor of Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, British Prime Minister, is traveling around the world, and he stops in Cape Town, South Africa. Now, as you will learn, South Africa has changed. During both World Wars, South Africa was run by the friendly to Britain Union Party. But in 1948, the hostile to Britain National Party won the elections. And they kept winning them after 1948. The National Party had established the apartheid regime. Apartheid in Afrikaans, that's African Dutch, means separateness, separation of the races legally. A more thoroughgoing racist set of laws than Jim Crow, in some ways more thoroughgoing than the anti-Semitic laws of 1936 or 1935 out of Nazi Germany. Everything, your education, where you could live, what jobs you could do, whether you could travel or not, how far you could travel, whether you could go overseas or not, all of this was determined by your race. Were you Afrikaans? Best rights. Were you English? Second best rights. Were you of mixed blood, white and white and Indian? Were you Asian Indian? Were you mixed blood black? Were you black? And those were the hierarchy of races. This is an embarrassment to the British Commonwealth of Nations, which is what replaces the British Empire after World War II. And Macmillan is going to make something very clear right in the presence of the South African Prime Minister. Macmillan, at the airport, he just stays for this speech. He lands, makes the speech, and leaves. Just sort of a drive-by. Says famously that the winds of change are sweeping across the whole continent of Africa. And what he means by this is Sub-Saharan Africa. What we're talking about when we talk about Africa in this lecture is not the Arab North. It's the Sub-Saharan black regions of Africa. And what Macmillan means by the winds of change is the rise of African nationalism and the belief among Africans that they deserve to control their own destinies. Many British are suspicious of this. These Africans have not had modern civilization, in some cases, for more than 80 years. Before that, some of them were Neolithic, New Stone Age people, hunter-gatherers, wandering. Some of them were Paleolithic, some of them were Neolithic, they were farmers. Some, like the Maasai and the Zulu, follow their cattle. So, to give people who are so recently in a state of savagery independence in the modern world is a bit of a stretch. for a lot of people, especially those white settlers in these African countries, because there is no local leadership. There's a very, very limited educated leadership in these countries. But Macmillan sets the tone. And what this really is the British have decided that if they're not going to be allowed by the United States to protect their empire, they're going to get rid of it. Let the Americans pick up the pieces. If you're not going to let us do things like Suez, which we were legally obliged to do, or at least legally permitted to do, because the Egyptians broke the treaty, then we're not going to play this game. We're going to get out of Africa quickly. And we'll do it the way you Americans want. No independence without black majority rule. No independence without black majority rule. So in all cases, the British are going to give independence to these former African colonies within a very brief period, from the late 50s until the late 60s, and just play basically hot potato. Here, you catch. And the local leadership starts out invariably as a British-style parliamentary democracy. But usually within months, they're overthrown by some form of socialist nationalist leader. And these socialist nationalist leaders are also fundamentally tribal. The colonies that were set up by the British and the French and the Germans and the others who set up colonies did not have their borders drawn to reflect tribal realities on the ground. Their borders were drawn as a reflection of European politics. So you have countries that are admixtures of different tribes who hate each other, who on their own, before European contact, at best had the civilization of the early Nile Valley before the pyramids. And now they've got assault rifles, electronics, dental equipment, and radio and television. And they've got freedom to do whatever they want. So the leading groups within these sub-Saharan countries, they start using the coercive powers of the modern state against their own people. In Central Africa, there's a region known, formerly French Africa, there's a region known today as the Central African Republic, CAR. And it was known as that when the region got independence from France, because France basically did a lot of the same thing. Not as much as the British did, though. The French made more efforts to retain happy contacts between the mother country and the colonies. A dictator named Bokassa ends up taking over the Central African Republic. He renames it the Central African Empire, proclaims that he is the reincarnation of Napoleon Bonaparte, and then starts cannibalistically eating his enemies to take their souls and to take their mojo. He does this publicly. The cannibal emperor of the Central African Empire is eventually overthrown after a few years, but he's there long enough to make his impact, make his impression felt. In general terms, and I'll go into this in more detail, the rapid independence of sub-Saharan Africa is a bloody disaster. And to this day, right now, let's see, it's the 2020s. Let's say the independence is granted before 1970. Let's say it's certainly before 1971 for the vast majority of Africa. So, 81, 91, 2001, 2011, 2021. That's 50 years. It's been over 50 years for most of sub-Saharan Africa for independence. They were only colonies in many cases for about 80 years, because the colonies in Africa were mostly set up in the 1880s and 1890s. Today, the most basket case region on the planet, failed states, one-party dictatorships, tribal violence, the use of dental equipment as torture device. Latin America is a good number two, but the worst place on earth is sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of poverty, in terms of dysfunction, the area does not work. It has not worked since colonial times in terms of giving a decent living standard and progress to its people. There are a few exceptions, and we will talk about those when we get to it. But Suez leads to the winds of change, but it also leads to something else. In 1948, a year after India and Pakistan are given independence, the British Nationality Law is promulgated. The British Nationality Law says that anyone in the colonies who wants to go to Britain upon independence can claim British national status and go to Britain. Now, this law is passed by the Attlee government, the socialist government, British Labour Party government, after World War II, amidst a bunch of other legislation like the National Health Act, which basically transformed British life. But no one pays attention to this. Nationality Act. What everyone expects is that the white settlers in Sub-Saharan Africa, when the countries are given independence, some of them might want to stay and bend the knee to their new African overlords, but many will probably want to return. So this is for them. However, so that it doesn't seem racist, there is no stipulation to this effect. After 1948, massive numbers of West Indians, that's Jamaicans and others from the Caribbean region, who are black, start immigrating to Britain. Massive numbers of Pakistanis and Indians shift their way to Britain, to such an extent that there are regions outside London today that are called Londonistan. London has a Pakistani mayor of Pakistani descent who's a Muslim. From black Africa also, Asian Indians who had settled there and black Africans begin settling in the United Kingdom en masse. By 1968, the character of most inner cities in Britain have been transformed from ethnic monoculture, Britons, basically descendants of the English and the Scots and the Welsh, to include people from all over the world. If there's a distraction, I'm going to have to separate people. What that means is, look, in the United States, we are an immigrant nation. Send us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I hold my light behind the beside the golden door. The Statue of Liberty poem. We're a nation of immigrants. The only exceptions to voluntary immigration are the natives who lived here and their descendants and the blacks who came here in chains. Everyone else came to the United States as a voluntary immigrant or had ancestors who did. I'm going to ask you to slow that down or stop it once you're done, or finish it quickly, just because of the distraction. In the end, Americans are used to absorbing people. Public schools were built in the United States in the late 1800s to make sure that the children of immigrants understood what it was to be an American, could speak English, could adapt and function within the United States. So in the end, the second generation immigrants, the Nisei as Japanese call them, would be American. Mom and Dad speaks the lingo of the old country. Mom and Dad have their old fuddy-duddy ways, but I can tell you this is what happened in my family. This is what happened in many of your families. Your ancestors came here and they became Americanized, mainly through the children growing up in the public schools. Teaching history, by the way, is central to that, to a new American identity. But Britain has no experience with this. France has no experience with this. This is something new in European history. Europeans had gone out into the world and settled other countries. Now we have people from radically different cultures, radically different ethnicities, some of whom worship radically differently. Got a lot of radical difference there. And the British and the French have no idea how to face this, how to assimilate and absorb and handle them. In France, you have people who are the great-grandchildren of the immigrants who arrive in the 1950s from Algeria and 1960s, who 4 generations in are not considered Franche Suisse of French stock. They are still treated like outsiders. Imagine being the grandchild of an arrival, an immigrant, and still being thought of as an immigrant. So the British actually have the most success in bringing them in, but it's a shock. A British politician named Enoch Powell, who was sort of an eccentric conservative, in 1968 made a speech to his constituency in Wolverhampton, which is an industrial town near Liverpool in the west of England. And in this speech, he says, "I see future as the Tiber, red with blood." And he's talking here about the difficulty of assimilating. Can you shut the fan off? I'm going to actually play the Rivers of Blood speech, and I will come back for video 2.